Hello. I'm very happy to spend some time with you today, and we're going to try to talk a little bit, thanks to Paul Swanson, who's going to interview me about the book and the ideas in the book, Immortal Diamond. So let's just leave it at that and dive right in.
Richard, the title of this book comes from a Gerard Manley Hopkins poem, and you quote a number of poets in this book. What is your sense on the role of poetry and the arts for assisting people in mining for their own immortal diamond?
You know, on a very real level, poetry and religion are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to find the inner meaning of outer things. They're recognizing that the outer world, the physical world, the natural world, is all a metaphor for the deeper meaning of everything. And so it's no accident that very often spiritual people will be inclined to write poetry or read poetry, and very commonly, good poets at least, will come to a kind of depth of spirituality. Not always, but very often it's the case, because it's a similar search. So I think that's why so many of us find poetry so fascinating and so helpful.
Thank you, Richard. How does the search for the true self change at different stages of life?
Wow. You know, I think we intuit it as a child, that we are who we are, and that's okay. Now, unfortunately, that always gets wounded, distorted, when love isn't mirrored toward us perfectly, which it can never be. So somewhere, usually around 6 or 7, we start organizing ourselves through our own thoughts about ourselves. And that becomes who we think we are. So we start with a sense of the true self. We lose it. Now that's symbolized in the scriptures by beginning in the garden, leaving the garden, the loss of innocence. It's not really, what most of us understood by original sin. We fell out of God's grace. It's more, we fell out of our own grace. And so we lose it, and you could say that much of the rest of the spiritual journey is now freely and consciously and deliberately and intentionally rediscovering and rebelieving what was already and always true. Now, many people don't seem to ever get there because the task of what I call the first half of life, the creating of your own persona, your role, your title, your education, your relationships, it takes up so much of your, well, not so much, almost all of your time and energy for the first 30, 40 years of life, that you become attached to it. You become identified with it. Now, if you're on course, and most people really are without even trying, is their identification with that false self tends to disappoint them, fall away, mean less and less. And so normally in your later years, you fall almost naturally if you're conscious. Now, a lot of people aren't conscious, but you fall out of this identification with your manufactured identity, your false self. You see that it isn't true because you can change selves. I'm putting on this mask today and this mask tomorrow. In a moment of honesty, you say, well, who am I really? Beyond what I need to be at work, what I need to be with my wife, what I need to be with my children, they're all fine. But you finally get a suspicion that there's a substratum, that there's something underneath all of these passing identities. So it does change. It's very hard to really rest in your true self in the first half of life. It really is, because you've got so much else to do. And all I can presume is God understands that totally. And then uses that as the raw material. That's why I say the false self isn't bad. God uses the false self and its failures to lead you to a humiliating but wonderful experience of who you were all the time, but you didn't know it. That's why the eureka moment, I found it moment, is very much the same for most of the saints and mystics. As Jacob says in Genesis, when he sees the angels moving between heaven and earth, you were here all the time and I never knew it. So it's always a rediscovery of what you first suspected, you first intuited as a child, but now you know it freely, deliberately, consciously, graciously. You say, my God, it's all a gift. That's what makes you fall in love, not just with your true self, but simultaneously with God. I hope that makes sense.
That's really helpful. Death and resurrection are common themes throughout this book. Would you say that the life, death, and resurrection cycle is constantly going on in our spiritual life?
Well, I'm glad the way you put that, cycle, because it isn't a one-time death and resurrection. That's why the born-again language is too static. It's not honest. They don't know it. They don't mean it to be dishonest. But it's the going through the cycle again and again of loss and renewal, having it, losing it, and realizing it's always given back to you gratuitously. That's resurrection. This undeserved life, this undeserved abundance that seems to come from nowhere. I was picturing actually in prayer this morning how picture a fountain with a whole bunch of tubes, each of those tubes being boundaries. We create the little boundaries. Well, God can't work beyond these because I have to earn it. I have to be worthy of it. I have to be in right and perfect relationship. And then picture the water coming through the tubes and overflowing the boundaries. That's the creating of the tubes, of the boundaries to love, the boundaries to worthiness. That's what the ego does constantly. Well, God couldn't be available to me now because I haven't prayed this morning. In fact, I sinned yesterday, or I'm a selfish person, or all the boundaries your mind will create. Well, you could not possibly experience grace. So picture a whole fountain of tubes. Those are all the man-made boundaries. And then picture the water coming through the tubes and overflowing all of them. That's the experience of resurrection. Death is the boundaries that we create, that grace could not move here. God could not love me outside of this order that I have created by my own mind. And then the experience of the overflowing abundance. My gosh, God loves me anyway. In fact, despite the fact that I sinned yesterday or didn't love my neighbor this morning. Now, when you allow that abundance, that's the experience of resurrection. And so resurrection isn't just a belief in a final resuscitation of the human body, but it's a constant experience of life if you allow it over and over again. Now, when you allow that cycle, as you well put it, finally it becomes your entire belief system. That there's always a death, and if you allow it, there's always a resurrection. And God gives seemingly, at least we would say it this way, both the deaths and the resurrections. And we allow both of them. So that's why we say Christ has died, Christ is risen is the mystery of faith. It's living inside of this cycle of learning it, forgetting it, learning it again. Learning it, denying it, learning it again. Until finally it becomes your pattern of existence. Okay.
A follow-up to that, how does this cycle impact our ability to grow in faith, hope, and love.
Well, yeah, that does follow nicely. That is precisely what it means to grow in faith, hope, and love. That each time you walk the journey, you allow the cycle, and you experience the outcome is always the same. Bigger life, enlargement of soul, enlargement of capacity to love. That's what we mean by growing in faith, hope, and love. We call those three the theological virtues. Maybe it's not the best name. Maybe you don't even get the point. But what we meant by that is the other virtues were acquired by practice, whereas faith, hope, and love were given out of nowhere. You don't know why you wake up some days and you have hope that life is meaningful, that God is good, that you are good. It always feels like it came from nowhere. So going through this cycle of death and resurrection enlarges the soul and makes you and allows you to experience a life that is always greater, deeper, bigger, and totally gratuitous. You know you didn't practice having hope. It's just there. And all you can do is thank somebody for it. But the path of coming to faith, hope, and love is walking the cycle of death and resurrection. And again, both of them are an allowing. You have to allow the dying and trust it. It's okay. It's okay. And you have to trust the resurrection too, which sometimes is even harder. To trust that God is really giving me an abundance of hope right now. You know, for some reason, the ego wraps around negativity. I don't know why it does that. It wraps around negativity. It's much harder, if you watch yourself, to wrap around joy. It is. To sustain any kind of honeymoon. You enjoy it for a moment and then, I don't know, you get lost in distraction. Whereas if there's a resentment or someone to blame or a hurt, you watch yourself. I watch myself. You'll just wrap around that all day. All day. I mean, it's really diabolical when you think of it. You can wrap around negativity all day, but to wrap around resurrection and to sustain it and to believe it, that's what it means to believe, is purely a gift of God. And that's why faith, hope, and love are the virtues that are not acquired but given. Okay.
Richard, you have written about religion playing a part in the enhancement of our false self. What role does a religious community, or a partner or friends for that matter, play in the discovery of the true self?
You know, really, we are 100% relational beings, just as God is 100% relationship. We Christians call that Trinity. That God is not a substance, God is a relationship. Now, once you know that everything we learn is in the process of giving and receiving, mirroring, mutuality, how I relate to this room, this day, to you, how I relate to anything in any one moment is finally who I am. Now, if I relate graciously, trustfully, humbly, the other in the community, the family, will be allowed to change me. That's what we mean by vulnerability, that we allow other people, outside experiences to change us. When you're blocked is when you don't let anybody influence you. That's what it comes down to. I'm not letting her in. I'm not letting him in. I'm not letting that suffering man's pain in. I read recently that the word empathy was not in the English dictionary until 1915, 99 years ago. Now, if the word empathy was not even in the English dictionary, you could conclude that humanity hadn't achieved a high degree of empathy. They didn't need a word for it. to empathetically, sympathetically, emotionally, relationally connect with what another person might be feeling. To really walk in their moccasins. How does that woman feel right now? That takes a high degree of detachment from your own ego center. That you let go of your ego center and, my gosh, instead of how am I feeling right now, how is he or she feeling? People, therefore, who are vulnerable, empathetic, they just keep growing. So love isn't just something you do and that's a merit badge. I'm a loving person. But love is what keeps you growing. Because the loving person, and I'm going to equate that with being a vulnerable person, allowing the experience of the other to influence you, that person just, they never stop growing. Whereas once you become blocked, which is, I'm afraid, what we mean by sin, people, pain, the human situation, the human tragedy is not allowed to change you. So that's why a lot of people stop growing at 12 years of age. They're so blocked that nothing new can happen. They pull everything inside of how does it affect me, not how is that person over there being affected. So they remain self-referential, as Pope Francis loves to say. As long as you're entirely self-referential, I'm going to use a biblical word, you're in the state of sin. I know that probably isn't the way most of us understood sin, but that's what I would describe as sin, really. When you're entirely your own reference point, you will die because you're not the reference point. You're not the center of the world. And each time you allow outer situations, the pain of refugees in Syria, the pain of immigrants is actually allowed to affect you. A tortured animal or an abused child really empathetically changes you. It's a big burden to carry. And so a lot of people stop feeling. They basically stop feeling. So how you relate, your capacity for relationship, in many ways is your capacity. In fact, it is your capacity for ongoing growth.
Here's a follow-up question. What are the common blockages to the discovering of our true self that you see in the world today? Whether it's culturally, socially, religiously.
You know, I would say, especially in this age of social media and the monthly increase of technological expertise, and here we are using wonderful technology to make this film, so I'm not against it. But it's become so fascinating and so momentarily available that I would say right now the single biggest thing that's keeping people from their true self is overstimulation. Overstimulation. Now that doesn't sound like sin, does it? But it's just, we can constantly find another distraction, another entertainment, another diversionary tactic. By the iPad, the iPod, the video, the CD, the computer. No one in human history had this much access to distraction. I'm not saying it's wrong, but if you don't find a way to limit it and to say, this is not who I am, this constant entertainment. Neil Postman said 20 years ago, we're going to entertain ourselves to death. It simply keeps you at such a superficial level of false self that you are this American Idol show for an hour. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch American Idol, but you better not watch it every night. You really better not, because it's going to keep you at a very superficial level. I would say the primary sin of the American culture is superficiality. That's what's keeping us from God. It's not what we used to call the hot sins, Maybe things like greed and ambition and lust will take over. They almost certainly will if you live at the superficial level. But those are symptoms. What we call the hot sins are symptoms of superficiality. Remember when you asked me at the beginning, the similarity between poetry and religion. They both look for the depth of things. What does this mean? What's really happening here? What's going on? So if you allow the Spirit to lead you to depth, you'll find that living on the surface, which is always entertainment, distraction, diversion, you'll find, frankly, it's less and less satisfying. I can do it, but I don't need it. I've found a much deeper well, a much deeper fountain, a much deeper satisfaction. Now, the word for that deeper well, bubbling up within you, as John's Gospel calls it, is the soul. You've awakened your soul. And once you've awakened your soul, you can enjoy externals entirely. But now you find the internal soul of everything else too. And that's what gives you your joy. That's what gives you your satisfaction. Okay.
Excellent. Richard, you wrote on page 93 of Immortal Diamond, your experience of your deepest and truest self and your deepest experiences of God will prove one another right and prove one another good. Can you expand on this connection?
Boy, you center in on things that I forgot I wrote. And I say, did I really write that? Do I really believe that? I think I do believe that. That the experience of the true God and the experience of the true self are almost, for all practical purposes, the same experience. That might surprise you at first, but that's why good psychology and good spirituality go together. And people who have honest self-knowledge will normally want good theology. And people who have good theology will be very open to honest self-knowledge. It always disappoints me when I often see, frankly, people at an immature level being afraid of self-knowledge. They'll call it mere psychology or New Age or the Enneagram or so, and then just dismiss it in one word. People who want to stay at a superficial level of God experience will almost always be afraid of self-experience too. They just want to believe glib doctrines, formulas, repeat scripture quotes adamantly. Almost as if to protest too much because they don't know the meaning of those scripture quotes for themselves. They don't know the meaning of that doctrine in terms of inner experience. So what you see in people who've had authentic experience of God is that they're not afraid of their own shadow. They're not afraid of facing their true self. It's not humiliating anymore. They're not humiliated by their humiliations. They say, of course, what can you expect from Richard? Anthony DeMello used to say, I'm an ass, you're an ass. Forgive, but he said it so well. That's what you see, that most of what we do is pretense. And when you're free to move beyond pretense and recognize your own shadow, limitation, sin, brokenness, poverty, limitation, use whatever word you want. But you find that once you face the worst, you're not embarrassed by it anymore. And you don't spend the rest of your life trying to cover it up from yourself or from others. If that isn't freedom, what would freedom be? When you meet a person like that, you tend to feel very safe and very at home in their presence. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Okay, I hope so.
I'm going to give you another one of your quotes. This one's from page 153.
153.
In the great economy of grace, all is used and transformed, and nothing is wasted. So my question is, how then should we be approaching or befriending our false self on the journey towards the true self, knowing that it's necessary and a part of life?
This is a very subtle but very important question, because otherwise we think that we've got to get rid of the false self, destroy the ego, exclude our sinfulness, when in fact those very things in our struggle with them are what leads us to enlightenment. It's not by eliminating it, because then we're dualistic, then we split. We pretend we're all light and we're not also darkness. When we stay in the bridge building, in the struggle, there it is again. There it is again. My gosh, I'm incapable of moving totally beyond it. Therese of Lisieux said, whoever can serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to herself, serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to herself, that person is a pleasant place of shelter for Jesus. That was her quote. Scott Peck told me personally that was one of the lines of greatest religious genius he'd ever read. Because he said what makes people of the lie, which was his term, the name of one of his books. He said, and why so many religious people become people of the lie is they will not serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to themselves. That's the recognition of the false self, the forgiving of the false self, the accepting of the false self. That I'm still taking myself too seriously because I'm a priest, or because I'm an author, or because I think I'm important, or I think I'm intelligent. Dang it! I wish those voices were entirely gone in me. They're not. And humbly saying, there it is again. And I'm afraid I'm stuck with it. But learning little by little to surrender my attachment to it, to identify with it less and less, but knowing it doesn't go away, darn it. It's still there. I learned to live with it in a forgiving way and a detached way. That's a very different path than destroying the false self. It's living in creative tension with it, allowing it daily to humiliate you, but also to expand you by remaining in the struggle with it. I wish someone had told me that as a young person, because I believe I was sent on a path of thinking I could actually eliminate the false self. And it leads you on a wrong course of denial, pretense, actually hypocrisy, which is, I think, why religion, even when it doesn't realize it, produces so many hypocrites. Because they really think they can completely eliminate the false self, and you can't. You simply stop believing it and identifying with it. And you allow it daily to humiliate you, to teach you, and to expand you.
Thank you, Richard. I have one final question that I think is really important to make sure I ask. Another theme that returns time and time again in your book is love is stronger than death. You say at its core, love itself is your true self. How would you recommend a person stay open to love as they traverse through the rocky periods of life?
Well, I was going in that direction early in the talk when I was talking about love is trusting the abundance, the resurrection that is always available, and knowing you're going to be sustained and that overflowing fountain is available. But it's not me producing it. It's not me sustaining it. It is me receiving it. Teresa of Avila, she said that, in the early stages of the spiritual journey, with our little hoe, we try to dig a trench from God's overflowing love to ourself. In the later stages, we simply allow the fountain to flow inside of us, and we stop digging trenches, which puts all the emphasis upon our own effort at being perfectly loving. I don't know how to love, but I can allow love. So it's growing in love, which is stronger than death, is more and more a process of deeper surrendering, deeper trusting, and deeper allowing. Now that will lead you to new doings too. But you know that it is being done unto you. You're not the primary doer. You're the secondary doer. And so each moment you simply surrender to this inner fountain, this inner availability of God, this inner access to grace. And that, when you recognize the fountain never stops, that's when you know that love is stronger than death. When you don't have access to that fountain, you start over-identifying with the death part. And I'm afraid a high amount of humans believe that death is stronger than love. Maybe most people believe that death is stronger than love. And that's why, ironically and sadly, they're so afraid of death. Because they're going to believe that death has the final word. Whereas the gospel is that, no, I promise you, love has the final word. So thanks for ending on that.
Thank you, Richard.
You're welcome. I hope it helps. Thank you for your trust. And you can believe and know all these things for yourself. Not because I said them, but because you can experience them. Thank you.